Good morning, everyone. We are in Mishna Arla. I dedicate this morning's learning in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shalamas Rabinos, Shalamas Bas Rav Yaakov Eliezer. And we are up to Parak Aleph, Chapter 1, Mishna Beis, Mishna 2. Eis Shabo Avoseinu La'aretz. At the time when our ancestors entered the land of Israel with Joshua, with Yoshua, Matzu Natua, if they found a tree that was already planted, Potter, they're exempt. Didn't have a din of Arla, had to be planted. When they came into the land of Israel and they just found the tree there was no law of Arla for that. Natu, but if they planted a tree, even though they had not yet conquered the land, Chayiv, the obligation of Arla does apply. Because if they planted in the land of Israel, then it's going to have the law of Arla. Even though many of the other mitzvahs hakliyas ba'aretz, mitzvahs that are connected to the land, only took place after Eretz Yisrael was conquered, Arla is different. We have a source from the Torah that Arla is different. Once they entered the land and they planted in the land, then it would have an obligation. Next case, hanoiteya l'rabim, the one who plants for public use. That means we're talking about where it's his land, it's his tree, he's planting it. But he's not planting it just for himself. He's planting it for anyone who wants to come to take. Chayiv. The halacha is, you're chayiv in Arla. That's considered based on the psukim and the verses that deal with the mitzvah of Arla, this is considered a regular way of planting, your land, your tree, you're doing it. So the fact you're doing it for the public, that doesn't make a difference. Rabbi Yehuda Paiter. However, the sage Rabbi Yehuda says no. In that place where you are planting it for public use, it would be exempt from the mitzvah of Arla. We do not follow the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Next, now here the case is where you're planting in a public domain. A public domain, everybody has a portion of that in that domain. Everybody has certain rights to use it. So we're talking about that you planted your tree for your personal use, but you did it in a public area. Or another case, a Gentile who planted. Okay, he planted a fruit tree. He planted a fruit tree. Just 1 second. Right. The case of the non-Jew planting, we are talking about whether he planted it on a Jewish property or even if he did it on his own property. Okay? If a non-Jew plants a tree in the land of Israel, it's his tree, it's for his use. Nonetheless, it is still included in the mitzvah of Arla. Now, by Gazlan Shanata, a robber who stole land and planted a tree on it. That's another case. Vanatea Besfina, or one plants in a boat. Now, here we're talking about a boat. It's a boat where it's an earthenware boat, and you fill it with dirt, and you're planting things in it. Because it's earthenware, the roots of whatever is growing are going to basically puncture through it and get nourishment from the land. Vayla me'elav, or a tree that grows on its own. You didn't plant it. Chayiv ba'arla, all these cases are obligated in the mitzvah of Arla. So again, if you planted it in a public domain, but we're talking about you're planting it in a public domain for your own use, or a Gentile who planted, whether he planted on a Jew's property or on his own property, a thief who planted. Now, the difference between the case of a thief and the public property, which means we see that Arla doesn't have to be your property. We see even in a public property that if you plant the tree, it's going to be obligated in Arla. But the reason why the Mishna has to mention about the thief, because it's a big difference between Reshus HaRabim and that. Reshus HaRabim, public domain, everybody has a right there. It's not yours, but you have a right to be there. You have a right to use it. In the Goslin's case, he stole the land. It's not his land. Nonetheless, it's his tree. The land is where it is. It's the land of Israel. And he planted a tree for his own use. It's going to have an obligation for Arla. Then the other case we said was when he planted in a boat, where the boat, again, you'd be talking about a earthenware boat, has no holes in it, but we assume that because it's earthenware, the roots are going to be able to basically puncture through and nourish from the ground. If we'll be talking about a wooden boat, you'd have to be talking about there's holes for the roots to be able to get out and nourish from the ground. Well, Elam again was the case where you didn't plant the tree, it just grew on its own. But again, it grew in the land of Israel, and it's in this case, they say, it's in a private domain, not a public domain, a private domain. In a private domain, the tree grows on a private domain, although you didn't actually plant it, it's going to be chayav in arla. Basically, there is an idea based on the words of the Torah that tells us the mitzvah arla, that the planting needs to be a, so to speak, a regular or normal type planting, which is typically done by a person for their own use. In a case like this, where we're talking about it grew on its own, we didn't plant it, but again, it grew on a private area, he's going to use it. That is considered regular or typical enough to be included in the mitzvah of arla, an obligation of arla. Okay. We continue with the laws of Rechilas, Klal Aleph, chapter 1, and we are up to Sif Hey, paragraph 5. Ein chilek beis sipur Rechilas. There is no difference when it comes to the prohibition of speaking Rechilas. Benim sipur loy me'atzmim eretzaynai, whether he voluntarily shared the information with Reuben about what Shimon said or did to him. Benim chaverei having katsas me'atzmim b'davar. Or let's say your friend, Reuben in this case, he already senses something. He senses that this guy said something to you about him. And basically he approached you and he's putting the pressure on you. Tell me what he said about me. Okay. Reuben comes over to you and say, okay, what did Shimon say about me? Either we're talking about your father or your Rebbe or your teacher. They're pressuring you to tell them what someone said about them to you. Even if it's only indirect rechilas. Nonetheless, in all situations, it's forbidden. You may not voluntarily say it over. You may not respond to someone, even under the person's pressure, even if it's a person you're obligated to respect. If by doing so, you would be transgressing the prohibition of speaking rechilas, you may not do so in any of these cases, in any fashion. Have a wonderful day.